Thank you to everybody for coming to this lecture. On behalf of the EU-LAC Foundation and the Latin American Studies Program of the University of Hamburg, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our audience from Latin America and the Caribbean and Europe, and our thanks to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Andreas Schleicher, who is the Director for Education and Skills and Special Advisor on Education Policy to the Secretary General at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. It is a pleasure to inaugurate today our series of virtual keynote lectures, all of which will be focused on the COVID-19 crisis and the pathway to sustainable recovery in the European Union, Latin American, and the Caribbean. With this series of keynote lectures, the EU-LAC Foundation and the Latin American program of the University of Hamburg would like to contribute to the generation of new knowledge and exchange between students, scientists, civil society actors, public officials, and decision makers on concepts and information which are useful for the recovery of our economies and for the well-being of our population in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Europe. In this first session, we are going to focus on the young generation of school pupils and the sustainable recovery of educational institutions. We feel particularly honored to address this important topic with the keynote lecture speaker for today, who will speak about the state of education on one year into the pandemia. Gracias a todas las personas que nos están escuchando en Europa, en América Latina y en el Caribe. Para nosotros es muy grato el poder inaugurar esta serie de conferencias magistrales que comienza el día de hoy a propósito de cómo nos recuperaremos en las diferentes regiones de la pandemia. La charla de hoy va a versar básicamente sobre la posibilidad de recuperación en términos de educación. Y nuestro agradecimiento a don Andreas Schleicher, que nos va a hablar desde la OECD sobre este tema. Bienvenidas, bienvenidos. Muchas gracias.
Tengo el grado de presentarle a nuestro ponente de hoy, al señor Andreas Schleicher, y como ya ustedes saben, actualmente es el director de educación en la Organización para la Cooperación y el Desarrollo Económicos, y su escritorio probablemente se encuentra en el Palacio La Muette en París, si no debe trabajar desde su casa actualmente. Su carrera profesional, señor Schleicher, empezó con una formación universitaria. Estudió física en Alemania, entre otras en la Universidad de Hamburgo, y matemáticas y estadística en un programa de máster de la Deakin University de Melbourne, Australia. Y como científico natural, me imagino que uno no tiene que dedicarse inevitablemente también a la investigación educativa. Sin embargo, esto lo hizo. Participó en un estudio sobre los conocimientos de los alumnos en matemáticas y ciencias naturales en todo el mundo. O sea, el estudio de las tendencias en matemáticas y ciencias, Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study. Y este estudio es iniciado y coordinado cada 4 años por la Asociación International Association for the Evaluation of Educational Achievement, con sede en Ámsterdam. De modo que su ruta de formación le llevó de Hamburgo a Melbourne y a Ámsterdam, y la próxima etapa le llevó a París, pues entonces puso su pie en el Center for Educational Research and Innovation de la OCDE en París. Y a partir de ahí, su nombre siguió difundiéndose por los medios de prensa como responsable del programa internacional para la evaluación de estudiantes, o sea, el informe PISA que conocemos todos, encargado también por la OCDE. Y debe haber cumplido sus múltiples tareas a plena satisfacción de los clientes, me imagino, porque a la coordinación de PISA siguió la coordinación del Programa para la Valoración Internacional de Competencias de Adultos, PIAAC, que se ocupa de las competencias de lectura, las matemáticas, así como de las competencias de resolución de problemas basados en la tecnología por parte de los adultos. Dios mío, y desde que se ocupó del informe PISA, estoy seguro de que ha tenido que organizarse un buzón mucho más grande. Me imagino que su experiencia es extraordinariamente demandada, especialmente en estos tiempos de pandemia, pero luego también en tiempos de post-pandemia o de prevención de deficiencias en cuanto a los prerequisitos y posibilidades de los procesos educativos y de formación. Así que podemos considerarnos muy afortunados de tenerla usted hoy aquí, por lo menos de forma sincrónica. Y ahora sí, le doy la palabra. Haga uso de ella. Take the floor, please.
Thank you so much. Gracias. It's a pleasure to share this session with you, and I look forward also to our discussion. These are difficult times for education in Latin America, in Europe, everywhere in the world. In the height of the crisis, you know, we had 1.5 billion young people who were locked out from their schools. And of course, you know, students who had learned how to learn, who had access to good technologies, who had a very supportive environment at home, for them, you know, this was manageable. But for the many young people who, you know, used to be spoon-fed by their teachers, not being able to learn on their own, who basically were not even maybe so motivated, who did not have access to digital instruments, and not, you know, parents who could take the time and effort to support them, they were left really badly behind. Now, when we look at the school closures, you can see it varied a lot across countries. And you have few countries like Denmark or Germany, New Zealand, that managed this really well. School closures were very limited. But then you look to Costa Rica, Colombia, and I can't even show you Mexico and Brazil on this chart, because essentially the schools have been closed for the entire year. Now, I want to bring in one more aspect that is actually quite interesting. You know, when we look at the pandemic itself, the infection rate, you see almost no relationship between, you know, the number of people or the share of people who got infected by COVID and the school closures. Now, you would imagine where the kind of pandemic was terrible, you had a lot of school closures, where it was not so bad, schools could remain open, but that's not what you see. Actually, some education systems that were very badly hit by the pandemic, you know, the one where I'm currently today in France, you know, is a good example. The pandemic was terrible, but schools remained open during the pandemic. And the same is true for other countries as well. So in order to understand that better, you have to add another aspect, and that is the quality of education. As we measure it through the PISA scores, the performance of young people, the frontline capacity. And when you do that, you can suddenly see a strong relationship. On the right side, where you have education systems that are doing well, that have a lot of frontline capacity, great teachers, a good line of institutional kind of working arrangements, you could see even when the pandemic was very bad, the dot is very large, they managed to keep school open. But on the left side, you can see many education systems, particularly in South America and Central America, where actually, you know, they were not so badly hit by the pandemic sometimes. But, you know, the performance was low. The capacity of the system to be resilient, to react, actually was very limited, and therefore schools closed and often didn't open. That's the reality in which we are. So we should not just talk about the pandemic as a health crisis. It is an education crisis. And the pandemic is also amplified the many inequalities in education within countries. Once again, students, who had learned how to learn, who could manage everything, they were, could find their way around school, closed schools, but students who did not were left very badly behind. And the same is true across countries. The lowest performing countries had the longest days lost. The highest performing countries were able to keep schools open. So this pandemic has just dramatically amplified inequality of many, many dimensions. When I look at school closures more recently, what I just showed you was for the last year, you can see in February this year, still many schools in Latin America and also in European countries were closed. It's interesting also that we have learned one important lesson, and that is to keep schools open for younger children. Now you can see when I look at pre-primary education, the lowest bar of primary education, the blue segment is open. Schools will remain fully open in a number of countries. Why do we do this? Because we know that digital technology does not provide a good alternative for the smallest children. And also, we know that learning is not a transactional experience. It's about a relational, a social experience. For the youngest children, school is not just, a place where they learn. It's also a very important social environment where you meet your friends, where you meet your teachers, where you meet other views of the world and things like this. And what you can see basically, most education systems have taken this to heart. Yeah, if you have to close education institutions, you close the high school, but not the primary school. But also, during the pandemic, of course, learning became digital. Technology became often, the lifeline for education. And you can see in most countries for which we have data, online platforms became very important. That's true for South America, it's certainly true for Europe. Sort of a lot of social and technological innovation to give students access to learning. But, many students could not use the internet or didn't have a computer, so take-home packages were also very successfully used. You think about countries like Peru, Colombia, they were quite good in getting materials to students. Television, nobody would have expected this before the pandemic. In many countries, actually Spain is a good example. Actually, Spain was very quick to get a good television program in place to help students, catch up, particularly the youngest students. And sometimes it was combined with mobile technology, television taking care of the broadcasting element, the transmission element, and mobile technology actually doing the interactive component. The city of Bogota in Colombia, very innovative, very quick. The city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, very innovative in combining television and mobile technology to get many people learning. And then, other technologies as well. So a lot of things were happening. But, it was a difficult moment. Education was really not well prepared for this. Now, when I look back to 2018, for example, did schools have sufficient devices for instruction? Well, some did. If you look to the left side, Singapore, China, Slovenia, the United Arab Emirates, there you can see, schools were very, very well equipped even before the pandemic. But if I go to the right side, Kosovo, Morocco, Brazil, Argentina, and so you can see actually it's a small minority of schools that had devices for instruction. And I like, to look at the column for Brazil. There is an orange triangle, which was, the availability of technology in disadvantaged schools, and a red diamond, which shows the availability of technology in wealthy schools. And you can see it's a huge gap. Once again, you can see technology amplifying social disparities. Now, I think that's one of the real dramas, that actually technology was supposed to be the great equalizer in our society, has really become the great amplifier because simply schools were not prepared for this. And buying the computers is the easy thing. What is often much harder is to have teachers who are really good at using technology to, redesign pedagogy. So when we survey teachers or school leaders, asking them, do your teachers have the necessary technical and pedagogical skills to integrate digital devices in instruction? Again, a lot of variability. The 4 regions in China that we surveyed, that is not a problem. But you can go even, to the right side. A high-tech country like Japan, no? It's a wealthy country. It's a high-tech country. But it doesn't mean that teachers are ready to use technology in the classroom. I think it's a very important lesson that we take, that basically, you need to make an effort. You need to get your teachers ready to support them. It will not come just by, the country becoming technological savvy. And once again, many countries in Latin America are at the lower end as well, having great difficulties getting the teachers up to speed with technology. But let me show you the most puzzling finding. Now, many would think, well, if you have technology, it's a miracle, and teaching and learning will all become better. Well, that's not what we find in our PISA study. In fact, what we found is quite the opposite. As you can see here on the chart, technology intensity in classrooms is often negatively related to the quality of learning. Now, the more students played stimulations at school, posting things on the website, doing homework on the school computer, downloading or uploading material, and so on, the more students did those things, the worse they performed in digital literacy. Now, what do we make out of this? It's quite strange. Technology is being used more and students do worse on it. And the answer is, well, maybe, the technology is good, but we're not able to use it. Now, technology can make learning also more superficial, more reactive, more stifled, more constrained. A lot really depends how the technology is deployed. How do we combine, 21st century technology and 21st century students with 20th century pedagogies and sometimes a 19th century school architecture? Very, very difficult, no automaticity. Very important lesson for the future. Just, adding technology to classrooms will not actually make things better. It could make things worse, as you can see here. It's actually also one of the lessons that Latin America learned very early on. One of the very first countries in the world getting every child a laptop was Uruguay. Well, if one looks honestly at the outcomes, very disappointing. People come first. You need to have your capacity to use technology will only be as good as it's actually being used. But let's get back to the pandemic. Here's some data from the United States, because I don't have this data for Latin America. You can see before the pandemic, the intensity of use of a very popular mathematics learning program in different social groups. In income and high income students, middle income students, and bottom income students. And you can see pretty much the same. But then the pandemic struck, and you can see everybody went down. Students no longer knew, were no longer supported, no longer motivated, whatever the reason, technology use went down. But then afterwards, you can see students from wealthy backgrounds very quickly recovered. Now, maybe their family, bought them the kind of access, or they were, the teachers told them this, and so on. But students from disadvantaged backgrounds, they remained left behind. That's, one of the tragedies that we have seen, that actually this pandemic has, helped those who already did well and left those further behind who were needing the help most now. One more aspect to add, protecting children online. Before the pandemic, it was quite rare for, teachers to give parents advice about screen time for young children, making sure that parents make wise use of computers, or give advice to parents on adult supervised use of technology by children, watching television, training teachers to help children and use digital technologies in appropriate ways. And not much was happening. Basically, most schools and kindergartens would tell, well, this is your business as parents. It's not our job. Well, actually, this has changed in the pandemic. When you look at the same figure after the pandemic has struck, many schools have taken more responsibility to give teachers and students and parents better guidance on how technology can help them best. And that's also, I think, a very important takeaway from the pandemic, that education is always a whole of society enterprise. You really need everybody. And teachers should not just think, what do I do in my mathematics class with the student? but actually, how can I help that student? How can I help that family? How can I become a good mentor, a good, a coach, a good facilitator, a good evaluator? Very, very important. And it has happened. It's actually very interesting. Many countries, this has changed. Let me come back to sort of how we help students at the risk of exclusion. Now, that's obviously, one of the big issues coming out of this pandemic. And on the positive side, in the OECD area, we have seen actually lots of efforts. Now, in over 80% of countries, we have seen subsidies for people to buy computers. They went to schools, they went to students. We have seen more flexible, more safe, self-paced platforms for learning, often asynchronous, giving students more control over how they learn, where they learn, and so on. We have seen improvements in the infrastructure in remote areas, support to learners from disabilities. Lots of things have happened. Some countries were very quick. Estonia invested in this kind of digital transition already many years ago. So when the pandemic struck, they were well prepared. Other countries were very dynamic. When the pandemic arrived, everybody wanted to buy computers. So it was actually very hard for schools to procure computers. Well, in the Netherlands, they were very smart. They basically said, well, there's so many companies or so many households that have old computers they don't use anymore. If we can mobilize them, get them in the hands of children, everybody will have a device to learn. And within 2 weeks, they were able to do this. Now, there's a lot of kind of resources in society that we often don't mobilize. But, learning losses is one thing. What we also know is that social and emotional needs are much harder to recover. Many young people during this pandemic have lost their confidence in education, maybe in their teachers. For them, they should thought, well, it really doesn't work for me. Will we get them back? Learning is always a social and relational enterprise. So I think that's one of the big questions in front of us, whether we can actually, rebuild that social capital, that social fabric that is education. Otherwise, we're going to see, which is already a big problem in Latin America, many young people not going to school. And the barriers are not always of an economic nature. They are often of a social nature. What's also clear is that, in the pandemic, you need to find different ways of learning, to construct learning environments differently. I think that's a very important lesson that we take, that basically, you can't just reopen schools. You need to make sure that schools are safe and that parents have, good confidence in the safety of the school. Otherwise, they're not going to bring their children back. And what you can see here in most education systems, there have been many adjustments to the schools and physical arrangements. People have created bubbles so that students would not contaminate each other so much. They have, reduced the class sizes. They have created, different physical spaces. A lot of things have happened to make schools safe. We have seen a reduction in extracurricular activities, which is a pity because sometimes those extracurricular activities are a very, very important part of the school day, where you work on projects, you experience things, and so on. We have seen a progressive return to school often. Again, younger students came back earlier than older students and so on. So many efforts have been made across the world to rearrange school, to make schools safe in order to allow students to come back even in pandemic conditions. Where you don't do that, you will not gain the confidence of parents. Now, you can open your schools, but nobody will come. You need to actually look into these things. And fortunately, actually, that has happened. Another question is, how do you protect teachers? And some countries, you can see actually for some for which we have data, they have given teachers priority in vaccination programs. It's obviously a difficult question. Everybody wants to get vaccinated first. On what basis do we decide that teachers should get priority? But most countries, or the majority of countries for which we have data, did that. They consider teachers very important social workers, frontline workers that need extra protection. And that, again, has helped to build confidence among teachers, among parents in the safety of schools. But I realize these are very difficult decisions. They are not, made very, very easily. Let's look in a little bit more detail also on the support to students and schools. And again, I think there's been a lot of effort being made. Most countries for which we have data have, started to build remedial measures to reduce student learning gaps. They're trying to sort of bring students back earlier with learning difficulties, give them extra resources, extra tutoring, big efforts being made. Probably not enough, but at least you can see here 80% of almost, over 70% of countries actually trying to do this. Assessment of learning gaps. Now you cannot remediate what you cannot see. So assessment was very difficult during the pandemic when the students are not present. You can't do tests and so on. So that's been remedial measures on disadvantaged students, learners with disabilities from disadvantaged. You can see actually a lot of strategies in place to help students recover. And I think, again, that's something that we should not forget for the time after the pandemic. Our, one-size-fits-all approaches to education are not sufficient. We need to be more granular, more nuanced. Different students learn differently and build more tailorized support systems for students. Also, in the area of vocational education and training, we have not seen enough. Actually, often, that training takes place at the workplaces, and employers, didn't want to have so many people around. So it's been a very, very difficult time for vocational education and training in these months of the pandemic. And then, of course, we're reaching out to students who need extra support, who are at risk, is one of the most difficult issues. You can see actually many efforts were made to reach out to students, refugees, migrants, displaced children, ethnic minorities, children with disabilities. First of all, to keep track of them. Brazil is a good example. A lot of efforts were made to find the students who were missing, to ensure that the system can actually keep track of them, support them. Also making sure that hygiene, sanitation, all of that is in place. That sometimes schools are a very important place for students to eat lunch and so on. So you can see actually a lot of efforts have been made. Sometimes cash transfers were used. A lot of things that I could talk about. One of the most visible shortcomings is that exams could no longer be done. That's impossible in a kind of pandemic context. To conduct your exams is normal. So many countries had to adapt them. And some countries had canceled their exams. Now, for example, here Spain did, and Norway did, and France did. And you can see the consequences. Now, suddenly graduation rates became much higher than before the pandemic, because when countries relied on the judgment of teachers were more generous than the exams, and that may be good for some students, but it's bad for the system. Employers don't know what to trust anymore, and I think that's something that we need to think about, how in this pandemic in the future to find ways, reliable ways to monitor student learning outcomes. Of course, you also need to think about how to mobilize teaching resources to sustain learning. And what you can see in our data is that many countries made extra recruitment efforts. For example, Japan and New Zealand are good examples where they got people back from retirement. They needed more people. They couldn't hire new teachers. So they actually asked retired school leaders and teachers to come back to help support the system. Or, give them extra money in some countries to make sure that they could provide extra hours, extra tutoring, all the things that were lost. Now, I want to mention one thing that I think we often look at the margins of education, and that's the interaction of schools and parents. What you could see, for example, is that during the pandemic, many creative ways were used to engage parents in the school education. Suddenly, parents were no longer part of the problem from the eyes of students and schools, but part of the solution. They were very, very important to make sure that home learning and distance learning and hybrid learning and so on really work. You could see, many education systems used, e-school platforms for teachers, students, and parents, phone calls, emails, regular conversations about student progress, video conferencing, a lot of things actually happen to get, parents on board. You almost ask yourself, why did we need a pandemic for this? No? This should happen on a regular school day, every day, to ensure that, parents are well integrated in the system and that we use their support. But, we've learned that lesson. Hopefully it will stay with us and remain kind of for the future. Supporting teachers, obviously also very important. You can see actually for teachers, the pandemic posed a huge and steep learning curve as well. Suddenly they had to use technologies that they may not have seen before. So a lot of training on technology is actually being invested at this moment. Trying to get teachers up to speed with devices, new technologies, new pedagogies. Very, very important. And you can see in most countries there are big efforts underway. That's an area where Latin America, in my view, still has a long way to go. The support for teachers on the digital front is still very limited. Teachers are often overwhelmed by the solutions. They have the technology, but they are not good enough in using it. The last point I want to make is about money on this, and that's obviously always a big issue. But the good news is that actually in the last year and also in this year, most countries were able to find additional money for education. I don't have so much data for Latin America, but for Europe, I can certainly say that most countries actually were putting more resources into education because all of the things I talked about do cost money. But, am I optimistic for the future? I'm not so sure. We saw the same picture during the financial crisis. Look at 2007, 2008. The GDP went down, the economies collapsed, but education spending actually increased. That's the green bar. So in the moment of crisis, countries, borrowed extra money, put it in education to keep systems going. But then when the economy had recovered in 2009, look at the blue bar going up. Actually, that's when the green bar went down. Actually, that's the moment when education budgets were cut. And I think that's a big worry that we should have also after this crisis. How do we sustain the investment in education after the pandemic? When the immediate shocks are forgotten, people get back to business. How do we ensure that at that moment there is enough investment in education? Because, at this moment, obviously, all our eyes are focused on the pandemic. But the future will always surprise us. Climate change is going to disrupt our lives much more than this pandemic. Artificial intelligence is going to push us to think much harder about what makes us human. The kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, they have also become easy to digitize, to automate. We know how to educate second-class robots, people who are good at repeating what we tell them. But what it means to be a human in this time, can you live with yourself? Can you live with other people? Can you live with the planet? Now, those are the big questions today. And then there are lots of other trends shaping the future of education. In 2018, in our last PISA survey, we surveyed countries on those issues around the future, the sustainability of the planet. And you can see, in almost 90% of the schools, school leaders said, yeah, we are doing all of this. We are incorporating, climate change and global warming in the school curriculum. And also, equality between men and women, international conflict, poverty, migration. It's all covered in the school curriculum. But it looks different through the lens of students. When we surveyed students, we found actually, the climate agenda is really urgent to them. The future of the planet, looking after the global environment is really important to me. 8 out of 10 students say yes. But when we surveyed them, can I do something about it? It was a much smaller proportion. And that tells you something. Our education systems are very good at, broadcasting knowledge, transmitting knowledge. But that's not what the future needs alone. We also need to do better to make students more active agents of change, students who take greater ownership over what they learn, how they learn, when they learn, where they learn. That concept of student agency is, I believe, really, really important to sustain the future of education. So, when we talk about the future, we should talk about less about, teaching students something, and more about helping students develop a reliable compass and the tools to navigate with confidence through the world in which we live. Of course, knowledge will always be important, but the kind of knowledge that will help us manage the future will differ. In science, for example, it's not just about, knowledge about biology and chemistry, the content knowledge. Even more important is, can you think like a scientist? Can you design an experiment? Can you distinguish questions that are scientifically investigable from those that are not? History is not just about, remembering names and places. It's about understanding how the narrative of a society has emerged, how it developed, how it advanced, and sometimes how it unravels when the context changed. Now, can you think like an historian? Can you think like a philosopher? Can you think like a mathematician? And those dimensions of knowledge will become more and more important, and they're much harder to teach. Why do I stress this so? Because this is exactly the picture we see for Latin America. Students are very good at reproducing factual content knowledge, but students often do not offer those ways of thinking that are going to be so crucial. If you do not have a deep understanding of the nature of a discipline, you're unlikely to acquire the knowledge of that discipline later in your life. You just learn for the school exam, and then afterwards you will have quickly forgotten that. Very important. And the knowledge is just the start. The world no longer rewards us just for what we know. Now Google knows everything. The world rewards us more and more for what we can do with what we know. So when you ask me, what are the most transformative competencies for tomorrow? I think the first is, our capacity to create value, to imagine, to build new things. That's what makes us so different from technology. But also it's about navigating ambiguity, managing and reconciling tensions and dilemmas. And then ultimately about taking responsibility, mobilizing our cognitive, social, and emotional resources to do something. It's also something that we try to measure in our PISA assessment. We call it the growth mindset. You could see on the vertical axis the performance of countries on the PISA test, and on the horizontal axis, the share of students who hold that growth mindset, basically like in Estonia, where they believe, success is something that is in myself. I can learn, my teachers will help me. And you compare that with Indonesia, where you have a large number of students who say, well, it's all about inherited intelligence. There's nothing I can do. And you can see here students in Panama, in the Dominican Republic, in many kind of countries of Latin America, they do not trust themselves. They do not believe in themselves. The education system tells them every day, there's nothing you can do. You'll just fail if you're not. It's all about talent. And that growth mindset is not just important for learning outcomes. You can see, for example, students with a growth mindset were more likely to be motivated to master difficult tasks. They had a greater sense of self-efficacy. They were less afraid of failure. They were establishing more ambitious learning goals for them. So if you think about the future of education, in the past, it was enough to teach students something. Today, again, it's about complex ways of thinking, complex ways of working. In the past, our economies only needed a few well-educated workers, so education could just sort people. And in Latin America, even in Europe, that's a lot what happens today. Education is very, very good to sort people, but not to develop them. Today, we need everybody. All people need to learn at very high levels, and that requires a very different caliber of teachers. And those teachers who are professional knowledge workers, the kind of people you want to educate your children. They don't like to work in the kind of factories that we have created in our schools. They want to see flat, collegial, entrepreneurial working environments. That's what the future of education needs to look like. Of course, nobody can predict the future. But we need to become better to imagine alternative futures. Think in terms of scenarios. And then if we are able to imagine different kinds of scenarios and are comfortable in them, I'm sure we'll be better prepared for whatever the future will look like. Of course, one scenario is simply that, the status quo will prevail. Education will just continue as it has. And, it's not so unlikely. What is very clear is that the status quo always have many protectors. And sometimes we as parents are more part of the problem than part of the solution. We get very anxious when our children no longer learn what was very important to us. Or even more when they start to learn things that we no longer understand. Teachers are sometimes more likely to teach how they were taught than how they were taught to teach. And as a Minister of Education, you can lose an election when something goes wrong, but you rarely win an election over education because it just takes so much time to translate good ideas into better outcomes. So it's really, really hard. You have so many vested interests in education. If we're honest, we build our education systems always around the interests and needs of adults, rarely around the needs of children. There is this big asymmetry between the costs and benefits of educational change. If I want to change something, I have to pay for it now, and the costs are certain, but I don't know what's going to come out. The benefits are uncertain. Lots of difficulties that we encounter. In other scenarios, maybe one day the system will just break apart under the pressure of digitalization. And technology, we had such a hard time, in education with it in the pandemic. But for our students, the digital world has already become the real world. In many countries, look at Costa Rica here. You can see basically 40% students, 15-year-olds, spend over 40 hours per week on the internet. The digital world has become the real world. But if you're a digital native born in the digital world, it doesn't mean that you're digitally literate. In fact, when we measured the share of students who were really good at using the internet to distinguish fact from opinion, to navigate complex information, most of the Latin American countries are very much on the right side here. Look at this. Look at the Dominican Republic, Colombia, Peru, Uruguay, Panama, very much in trouble on this. Now, the majority of children in those countries does have great technology, but poor digital skills. And that's almost the worst combination. So, if we want to go towards a scenario where, education is more ubiquitous, technology and so on, we need to massively invest in the digital skills of people. In other scenarios, of course, that schools take on more social responsibility rather than becoming just academic institutions. They'll become centers of our societies. And you can see that trend in Northern Europe. Now, if you go to Estonia, if you go to Finland, to Denmark, schools are really the center of communities. They play many roles. The learning is just one of them. But if you want to do that, you need to build a lot of institutional capacity. And you can see actually in many of the countries, schools have a very limited role as designers, creators of their environments. Most of the decisions in countries are often taken, by, higher levels of authorities. If you want your schools to become the center of the community, you need a lot of enabling kind of factors in there. One last scenario, maybe one day we will no longer learn in institutions. Learning will be everywhere, anytime, anyhow, enabled by great technology, and not leaving us in school, but accompanying us throughout our adult lives. But it also raises very, very important questions. Where is the balance between humans and technology? What are the tasks that we want to delegate to our computers, and where do we actually find humans very important in this field? if we do not ask ourselves that question very carefully, you know, we become all victims of algorithms. They will take over our lives, our feelings, our thoughts, everything. We want to actually steer that. We need to be very, very active in this. And we need more innovation in education. Now, what you can see very clearly is that, you know, the share of global venture capital in education is still tiny. No? If you compare that with health or other sectors. No? And it's mainly a story about one country. You know, in 2040, you could see the majority of venture capital came from the United States. In 2020, it's mainly a story about China. The rest of the world doesn't care very much about innovation. It doesn't invest very much in innovation and education. We need to change this. Well, you know, you can construct an endless range of scenarios, and we have run out of time, so I'm not going to go through any more of those scenarios. But what I want to show you is just it's important to become better at thinking about alternative futures and position ourselves. Imagine, what do they mean for the goals and functioning of education, for the organization of structures, for our education workforce, for governance, and for our public authorities. It's ultimately about finding the right balance between modernizing our systems and disrupting them. Reconciling new educational goals with our existing structures. Educating students who are globally minded, but locally rooted. Fostering innovation while recognizing the very conservative nature of the education enterprise. Leveraging new potentials with existing realities. And finding a better balance between learning and education. Well, thank you very much. Gracias. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Schleicher, for your overwhelming presentation. It was really touching upon all the dimensions that we can imagine related to education, but actually related to our societies as a whole. Before passing the floor to my colleague Marcella, who will resume some of the questions that are just being formulated by our audience in the chat, I would like to ask you one first question. Imagine you were sitting in front of a politician, say a politician in Costa Rica, who takes decisions on education. All of those scenarios, all of the needs you mentioned, which one would you prioritize in order to give to the hands of a politician a concrete package of 3 key recommendations on how to reform the educative system in order to address the challenges which are ahead of us and to also make the system more inclusive? And at the same time, how much in percentage of the overall budget of a state should this politician try to reserve to invest in the education sector?
Well, actually, you know, the Costa Rican minister is already quite lucky because they have money for education. Actually, Costa Rica has always prioritized education. It's not the case in many other countries in Latin America. Well, you know, the one thing, if I had to choose one thing, many Latin American countries have tried to make teaching financially more attractive, you know, paying teachers a little bit better. And that's, I think, on a good path, but I think they have not made teaching intellectually more attractive. And that's, you know, putting one of the big brakes on those education systems. The quality of education will never exceed the quality of teachers. And I think it's not enough to provide decent salaries. It's more important to offer people an attractive, stimulating career, collaborative culture in schools where you, as a teacher, continue to learn every day, particularly when, you know, something like a pandemic happens, so that you are in an environment where school is not just a place where students learn, but where everybody learns. And I think that's, you know, if you can do only one thing, I think that is really, really important. Create an environment where your teachers continue to grow in their careers.
Thank you very much. I pass the word to my colleague Marcela Mello.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you very much, Professor Schleicher. I have 3 questions, and one of them is a comment. So I will read it literally in order that you maybe can make your opinion on this. So first of all is thank you, Christina Popescu said in the chat, thank you very much for the talk. This is rather a private comment. You mentioned student agency, but at the same time, you don't trust teachers assessing them during the pandemic and believe in the hierarchy made by the employers. There is a contradiction here. If we want to empower students and make them tomorrow's citizens, we need to change the hierarchy of values and the competition-based recruitment practices. I don't know if you want to come on this, or should I read the next questions?
No, I think it's a good question. You know, I do believe student agency, if we take it serious, really means that we give students a role in shaping, in co-creating the learning environment, and maybe also the criteria by which, you know, their work will be assessed. I'm not seeing that, you know, I think our societies will always remain competitive. You know, I think the skills that people develop will be very influential on their, you know, social outcomes, on the economic outcomes. But still, you know, I think the way we develop those skills and to ensure that every person has a full chance to realize their potential, I think that's really where the effort needs to go. And so I think, you know, I think we can reconcile this. I also think, you know, we should listen more to the voices of young people when it comes to their learning. I think we have, once again, often education systems that are created by adults around their own kind of beliefs and interests. And you have a young generation, for example, for whom now the environment, the climate is really important, really urgent. Maybe we should, you know, take that to heart and, you know, help them to learn what is their future, not our past. No?
Okay, thank you very much. And Dr. Gunia from the Uni Hamburg have 2 questions for you. The first one is, to what degree do you think your results depend on a knowledge of cultural context? For example, when it comes to designing, now with the pandemic experience, a learning compass for specific countries. And the next one is, how did you get the data, especially in the pandemic times when educational institutions are under more strain than in normal times?
Yeah, you know, I think the cultural context will always be a very important factor, and we do actually pay a lot of attention to capturing it very well. We capture it through the eyes of students. We ask them about, you know, their cultural context. We capture it through their parents, their teachers, the schools, the system. We want to get as many perspectives on this in our data collection to understand the context in which students learn, teachers teach, and schools and systems operate. But I want to add one more dimension to this. I think sometimes we too easily attribute things to culture. You know, culture is always, you know, the context, something that is immutable to change. We easily sort of project things on that rather than, you know, seeing culture as something that is created by what we do, not just inherited. You know, what I hear often when we do comparisons, oh, well, you know, you can't learn from Japan because the people there are very social, very collaborative. They have a sense of community that we don't have in the Western world. And that's true. But, you know, why is it like this? Well, history plays a big role in this, and, you know, many things, the environment and so on, but also the education system. If you go to a Japanese school, you know, you will have students learning from each other, with each other. As a teacher, you're a great moderator of that kind of process. The students, the higher performing students will help the poorer students. The class is always judged on its collective performance. And then, surprise, surprise, that's something which people, you know, inculturate. And then the culture becomes the product of this. So I think it's very important that we do not, you know, use culture as an excuse why certain things can't be done, but we should see culture often as an outcome of our collective behavior, maybe sometimes over many generations. And so that's and what we try to do is basically look at culture in as many different ways as we can through the eyes of students, teachers, parents, and the system to understand its impact now.
Thank you very much. I have also another question, or perhaps two questions to you. On the one hand, what we have seen in Latin America especially is that there is the big risk of a high dropout rate of students who haven't visited the school for 1 year or even more. Which would be, from your side, good practices that you have seen in your analysis in order to get back those students back to school? Which are good practices in it? And something similar, you have also talked about measures targeting a population at risk of being excluded. And again, the societies in Latin America are very, very unequal, and their educational systems as well. Have you seen good models, good instruments in order to target these populations, which you could recommend to learn from those examples?
Yeah, first of all, on dropout, this is not just the story of the pandemic. Latin America has a long history of dropout and also great repetition, all of those kinds of mechanisms. The pandemic has, amplified it, but it's not created this. And we studied that in quite detail, particularly in countries in Central America, Ecuador, Guatemala, and so on. I wouldn't even say that all or even most of this is economic in nature, students not being able to afford school and so on. A lot has to do with the loss of relevance. There are young people who basically say, look, what I learn here in school makes no sense to my current and future life. There's no point for me to spend my time. I can, earn money on the street or somewhere in a more rapid way. That's the question that we often ignore. We think, oh, we have to, give subsidies and all of this. No, I think a big answer is to make learning more relevant. If you would run a supermarket, not a school, and every day you find that from 10 customers, 3 go out and they don't buy anything. One day you start to change your inventory. You start to think about, what can I do different? And we don't do that in education. We teach people trigonometry when they are 10 or 15, when they are 15 years old. Whatever happens in our society. So I think that for me is a very, very important point that I think Latin America needs to take to heart. The dropout is not just economically motivated. It has a lot to do with the relevance. Now, during the pandemic, of course, it's got a lot worse. And I think it is very difficult to get students back. And, the only people who can do that are the teachers and the school leaders in the schools. There's nothing you can do from the outside. Countries like Brazil have been very successful with incentive schemes. So they have said, for example, parents will only get social benefits if their children are in school, and so on. Those things can work. I think Brazil is an example which has been very successful in using social welfare benefits to get schools back to school. But ultimately it's up to school leaders. And I've actually seen that in a school in Brazil, where a school principal went from class to class every day, looking at who was not there, calling up the parents, why is your child not here? What are you doing? And so I think that's the effort that you need. You cannot, short circuit this with some, general policy. You need to motivate teachers and school leaders to actually look after the students who've got lost in this year.
Thank you very much. I also would like to leave the space for my co-moderator, Dr. Gunya, in case you would have another question. And I also continue to invite our audience to formulate their questions through the chat function.
Yes, one of my questions you actually didn't answer because you forgot about it. It was the question about how did you get your data in these times? Because we actually are trying to teach our students how to of social sciences, how to get how to do investigation by digital terms without going there in the campus and in the field and studying the field directly. So this is a really important question for us, how to get data in these times, in these pandemic times. You mentioned students and their parents. How do you get the data?
Yeah, at the OECD, we have our surveys that we administer and to individuals, and that's sort of a big source of data. But, technology is also becoming a better and better data source. When students are using learning platforms, we learn a lot how different students learn differently and so on. So I think, we need to become creative. But at the OECD, we have conducted the first survey in March last year, then another one in the summer last year, and the latest one is just done in February this year. So we've tried our best to collect good information from the education institutions.
Thank you.
Profesor Schleicher, yo quisiera también hacerle una pregunta y va un poco más dirigida a estas manifestaciones que hemos visto en América Latina y que también ha impactado a varios sectores, y uno de estos sectores es la educación. Uno de los clamores asociados a estas protestas es que la falta de inversión en los programas de educación por parte de los estados tiene que ver con este temor de los tomadores de decisión para la estimulación de la masa crítica. ¿Cuál sería su opinión frente a este tema?
Sorry, I didn't get the last part of the question. It's critical thinking.
La pregunta sería que, ¿cuál es su opinión frente a la relación que existe entre la disminución de la inversión a los programas de educación y el temor que se pueda tener a que las personas puedan estimular esto que usted también mencionó en su presentación frente a la capacidad de pensar críticamente los problemas sociales que tenemos?
Yeah, the two are very closely related. In fact, I can tell you in many Latin American countries, we find less than 1 in 10 students who can distinguish fact from opinion in a reliable way. So I think that's the reality, and that is related to the general performance of the education systems. The two are not disconnected now. And in the future, the fewer educated people you have, the more unhappy people you have, because our success in life, in society, in the economy will increasingly depend on the quality of our education. So I really think that societies that do not invest in their future, which is the education of people today, will face a very hard time. They will have very polarized kind of opinions, very polarized societies, people who cannot navigate the knowledge and information. And I think, our schools today will be our economies tomorrow. No, I think that is very clear.
Muchas gracias.
Mr. Schleicher, you also mentioned a lot of key skills and competencies that should be at the core of our education systems, which I found very, very interesting. My question would be, how would you recommend to adjust the curricula of the future teachers in order to be able to transmit those values, this other kind of mindset of growth, how you called it, to the next generations?
Well, if you look at Latin America, we've studied the curricula of most countries. The big issue is that they just are completely overloaded. Young people are taught too many things at very superficial level of depth. You have curricula who are 1 kilometer wide and only 1 centimeter thin. And I think the best service you can make to the next generation of students is to teach fewer things at greater depth. Now, once again, don't teach them 20 or 30 formulas and equations on a day. Teach them how to, one mathematical concept. Now, in the world in which we live today, you don't need to be able to calculate an exponential function, but you need to understand the idea of exponentials. That's what the pandemic is about, and so on. So I think teaching fewer concepts at greater depths will address, I think, a big part of the issue. The other part is working more to teach and learn across the curriculum. If you bring teachers from different disciplines together to co-design the curriculum, the implemented curriculum, you make student learning more project-based, more theme-based, more real life. And I think that will, get your students more interested. And I think you have many, many benefits. So teaching fewer things at greater depths, integrating, helping students to think across the boundaries of subject disciplines and to see the interconnections, I think is very, very important. But also, finding a better balance between cognitive skills and social and emotional skills. Once again, the future is not just about reproducing knowledge. It's about, can you live with yourself? Can you live with other people? Can you live with the planet? Now, those are the big questions. And I think that at the heart of this is really good and relevant teaching. But, I come back to, an example like trigonometry. When I actually... when we studied curricula in Latin America, I asked myself, why do students learn that amount of trigonometry? And, first of all, I asked the mathematicians and say, well, is trigonometry really the central idea of mathematics or the heart of, mathematical thinking? And they said, no, it's just, one specific application. You don't really need that. Then I said, oh, well, maybe it's the employers who really need people with those skills. And I asked them and they said, no, that's all done by computers. We don't need those kinds of skills. The reason why we teach trigonometry in Latin America is because in Europe, those skills were used 400 or 500 years ago when people measured the size of the fields and built their houses with those kinds of techniques. And these things have survived. And, everybody says, oh, well, these were so important things in the past, you cannot take them out. So every day we add something new to the school curriculum, and we don't have the courage to take out the things that have zero relevance today. And people make those arguments on all sorts of grounds. I often hear, well, we teach Latin because it strengthens logical thinking. Well, then I would say, well, if you want logical thinking, teach people logical thinking and think about, how to do this best in the world of today. Don't use the techniques of 1,000 years ago. And we do too little of that. I think actually many of the problems that you see in Latin America, and I think in European countries too, are made by the education system itself, by teaching stuff that actually, and nobody asks this question, why do we do this actually? People, the argument they will give you is basically because we've always done it.
Profesor Schleicher, tenemos otra pregunta en el chat y se refiere, en su opinión, ¿cuánta influencia debe tener la política nacional en la educación y cuánta independencia deben tener las instituciones educativas locales en la creación del currículo escolar?
It's a good question. I think we teach for society, and therefore I think the curriculum design should also be reflecting the different interests in society. Now, I think you want the students to be part of this, the teaching profession, learning science. You want maybe employers to be part of this. I think it's very important to have a whole of society perspective on what young people should be learning, and to have also a process by which these perspectives are carefully negotiated. And I believe, the stronger your education profession, the less politicized will be your education system. The reason why in some Latin American countries education is so politicized is because the profession is very weak. If you have this idea that, a government decides what millions of students are learning, you don't have a good education system. If you have a strong profession, educators, institutions, society actually working that out in a long-term process, public policy is not so central to this. Politicians will not really, intervene very much in this because this is owned by the education profession. And we lack that. We have the kind of political influences actually come in when the education system is weak. And it's also very risky. You know, if teachers in the classroom have this idea that, oh, well, you know, the paradigms in education will be redecided every 4 or 5 years when politicians are re-elected, they will not trust anyone. You know, you will not change your behavior if you know what you do today is going to change in 4 or 5 years. So if you want actually people to build trust in the system, to actually change their behavior in the long run, you need to have this kind of continuity and coherence, and that will only come from the people who are the experts of learning, the educators.
Thank you, Mr. Schleicher. I also would like to get back in another group that you addressed actually in your presentation, which are the parents. The parents had a hard time actually to dealing on the one hand with their own work, with work done at home, and at the same time they converted themselves in teachers, or at least co-teachers in many cases. I found it very interesting what you addressed by saying that the relationship between teachers and parents has a little bit changed. Which would be your recommendations for the parents in order to continue trying to develop the skills of their student, of their children, and at the same time to not overarch them with just doing more assignments and being a co-teacher at home? Which would be your recommendations?
Well, you know, actually, I think the engagement of parents during the pandemic is one of the very important positive outcomes of the pandemic. I really think it's very important. You know, I was once in Yunnan province, one of the poorest areas in China. And I was very impressed how parents were contributing to the school. You know, they were bringing the school meals, they were, you know, tutoring children, all of these things. And then, you know, I asked a teacher, how in this province, you know, these parents had no education on their own. They were never gone to school. Why they were all so sort of interested in education? And the teacher said to me, well, you know, I try to call every parent about twice per week, and not just about education, but also about parenting, about, you know, this is about building friendships and so on. And then I ask her, oh, wow, you know, that must be a huge workload for you in addition to all the teaching. And then she looked very surprised and said, yeah, true, but I never thought about it like this. You know, if they wouldn't all help me, I couldn't do my job. So suddenly, you know, the parents were really part of that equation, and they were part of that process. They were not, you know, I think one of the worst problems that we have seen in education over the last decades is a trend towards, you know, a kind of commodification in education. You know, students became consumers of learning content, teachers became service providers, parents became clients. You know, I bring you my child and give it back to me ready to go to Harvard. You know, that's the mentality that we've created. And I think that's very unhealthy. I think we need to find a way to reintegrate, to make education, again, a project of a society where parents are very active players in this. They're not seen as part of the problem, but really part of the solution. And again, I think that's something that the pandemic probably has made a big contribution to. Also from the side of parents, you know, parents probably have a much better understanding what the teachers actually do, that it's actually not that easy what teachers do every day in the classroom now.
Thank you very much. Perhaps one last question from my side would be, you gave your presentation the title, The Pandemic Past the First Year. We are right now heading, or amidst the second year of the pandemic. In Latin America, it is the second school year, which is ongoing, and where for many pupils, there are still no classes given. And in Europe, we are heading towards the summer vacations, and many people ask themselves, what lessons should we learn from this first year, and what could we do better in the second year of the pandemic? For example, in terms of a good balance between homeschooling and presence schooling, and good methods in order to not lose track of the important skills and contents that students should take with them and should develop for their own future, for their benefit.
Well, I think first of all, it's important to get our priorities right. I think many countries in Europe and South America are keeping their shopping centers open and close their schools. There's something wrong. I also think, when you go in a poor, in Peru through a shopping mall, it's, very shiny, beautiful building, and then you go to a school and it's collapsing and so on. I think this is something, a sign that, we got to get our priorities strong. In the second year of the pandemic, we should have learned how to keep schools open and functioning, even in difficult circumstances. I don't think there's any excuse for what we see happening. Maybe we have to do things differently. Maybe we have to be more creative. But I personally think, even in a difficult pandemic context, we know how we can run safe schools, and that is what we should be seeing. Probably, we should also, make better use out of technology. For example, we should use schools as social places for what they're best, namely for the interactive, for the communicative part, for the knowledge transmission, that can be done through modern technology. So I think a more deliberate, more conscious use of the social spaces, then I'm sure we can also deal with the kind of capacity constraints that education systems are running through. But for me, the big question is, will our societies get the priorities right? The biggest choices that every country has to make is between the present and the future. And I think we've got that wrong on many parts. The environmental question is the most obvious part. We have burned the trees of tomorrow for our consumption today. We've spent the future of the environment for our past. In education, we make the same mistake. Look at this around the world. It's not a question of money. If you look at Chinese parents and grandparents are going to invest the last time, the last effort, the last resources in the education of their children, the future of their country. They know that the future is valuable, and they all make that collective investment. They don't have more money than the rest of the world, but they invested money in the future. In the Western world, in Europe, we have already spent our money for our own consumption. That's why we are so highly indebted. And every day we take more public debt. Latin America is not far behind it. I really think that is the fundamental question. The question of the pandemic is really quite marginal to that.
Thank you. I pass the word to Dr. Uña.
Sí, estaba pensando durante su interesante ponencia, estaba pensando en las protestas estudiantiles de 2019 en Chile. Y estas protestas estudiantiles estaban dirigidas contra el sistema educativo en Chile. Por ejemplo, Chile es miembro de la OCDE. Y los estudiantes reclamaron, entre otras cosas, una educación pública gratuita, ¿no? Y se refieren a la educación, no a la educación primaria, que es gratuita, sino a la secundaria. Así que no es, oportuno buscar primero una solución a este problema del acceso de los estudiantes, de los alumnos al sistema educacional, y después hablar sobre los contenidos de la enseñanza. Esa es mi pregunta. O sea, por eso pregunté antes por los contenidos culturales. O sea, no es que hay que tener en cuenta también estas dinámicas actuales en cada uno de los países. O sea, yo me refiero a Latinoamérica, claro está.
Yeah, actually, first of all, I think it's great that students demonstrate for education. I think, I wish we would see that in many more countries. And I was actually quite closely involved in that. I was working with the president on those issues in the country. I think, the demonstration should be for better education, and if the country is ready to invest more money, you can have free education. Where I had trouble with the demonstrators, and I said this publicly, if you have limited resources, spend them on the smallest children. Now I think the idea to spend scarce public money on people going to university who have survived the school, and to save money on the primary school students, I have difficulties with. So I think that really is, the hard choice. If you have money, you can help everybody, but if you have to make limited choices, I do believe that public money is more important in primary schools than in universities. And in universities, you can also look to other solutions. You can look to income contingent loan systems and so on. I think we need to be more creative there, but I think what I worry about is really the foundations that we built. Most of the education systems in Latin America are highly biased towards older learners. They spend, in Mexico and Chile, 5, 6, 7 times as much on a university student than on a primary student, and that leads to the kind of inequalities that then you have later. So I think that's the argument where I had some disagreements with the students, but I think the idea to demonstrate for better education, to demonstrate for more resources in education, I wish we would see that in more countries.
Agradecemos mucho, señor Schleicher, su contribución muy interesante del día de hoy, y le deseamos todos los éxitos también para su trabajo. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, thank you.